The National Museum of Funeral History presents The Final Curtain Never Closes. I'm your host, Genevieve Keeney Vasquez, the president and CEO of the museum. Today we're going to go a little ways back in time, perhaps maybe 5,000 years in time. We're going to go back to the time when burial customs and rituals were actually recorded on the walls of the pyramids in Egypt. Here we learn that there was a practice of caring for our dead, a way of preparing the body for burial, and what the significant rituals that were taken during the Egyptian time period. And why do we talk about the Egyptians when it comes to the funeral practices we know of today? It's very important to understand that the Egyptians were our first embalmers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the basic rites in all of our cultures, and then we'll circle back to the Egyptians. Everyone has a right to a decent burial, as believed by the Egyptians, and it's also used as a final disposition for the dead. And we still use that term today, of the final disposition. And it's also a necessity that we dispose of the remains of our deceased, because it helps to create closure for the family, render respect for the body, and help maintain the health and wellness of our society. There are different types of final dispositions. We have burial in the ground, we have entombment in caves and pyramids, and we also see cremation on funeral pyres. But there are many more types of dispositions as we continue to move forward in our current day and time. But we're going to go back again, like I said. We're going to travel through time, and we're going to focus on the burial rituals and cultures of the Egyptians. We have come to learn through the writings on the walls of the Egyptian tombs and pyramids that ground burials were the most common form of interment of the deceased. The bodies were wrapped in a cloth or a woven mat or skins, and they also included items for their next life, such as food, tools, and other emoluments that they believed that they needed in the afterlife. The bodies then were placed in a protective burial vessel. In the Egyptian times, many were placed in a sarcophagus, which is also what we would consider a casket today. And burials became more and more elaborate as time passed and as cultures became more organized. So we found that many times there was an entombment of the body. The entombment also included being buried in caves and or natural structures, not just the ground. And the tombs also were carved out of stones or mountains or built in man-made structures, such as the Egyptian pyramids. You can still see some of these ancient Egyptian cultures today when visiting Egypt and actually going inside the pyramids. The ancient Egyptians dominated the world for over 5,000 years, which is much longer than any ancient or modern culture. They began in the era of 3,100 BCE, and they continued until the Roman conquest. And everything was centered around their funeralization and their ability to achieve immortality through the preparations of the body. And the preparations of the body is known as embalming. The Egyptians had different death beliefs. They believed that the body was made up of 6 different elements, and they worshipped the sun and the cult of Osiris. And they believed that there was an afterlife and that it revolved around the circle of necessity. There are 4 beliefs that we will expand upon. The first is the elements of the body, and there are 6 of them. The second is the theologies of the sun worship, and the third is the cult of Osiris, and the fourth is the circle of necessity. So the Egyptians believed that preserving the physical body was crucial for the afterlife. So the Egyptians are the ones that invented the practice of embalming and the process of preparing the deceased body for a proper burial. Embalming rituals were reserved for the pharaohs and the elite, as the process was very time-consuming and expensive. However, the Egyptians developed advanced techniques for preserving the body, including using resins, oils, and other preservatives. The Egyptian empire's wealth and power allowed them to invest in significant resources into perfecting the art of embalming. The Egyptians believed that the body was made up of 6 different elements. They also worshipped the sun and the cult of Osiris, and they believed that the afterlife revolved around the circle of necessity. The 6 elements of the body that we'll look at are Ba, Yaka, the name, shadow, heart, and Ka. These are important elements of the body as they helped to direct the embalming process. The Ba is the soul that comes from the deity or the higher power. And the Yaka is the shining one, which is your Ba and Ka together. I know a lot of these terms are not what you hear about every day, so it might be important for you to have a little bit more understanding of them, as they were very significant to the Egyptians. However, the name, we all know, is that in which identifies the body. The shadow is what they considered our flesh and bones. The heart is your seat of intellect and emotions, which is what we attribute to the brain of today. And the Ka is what kept you happy, and it fed your spirit. And that is the most important element of the body. Now I'm going to go a little bit more deep into each element of the body. The Ba is what went into the hall of truths upon death. This is where the Ba stood between divine judges, and then the heart was placed on a scale and was weighed against an ostrich feather. The feather represented truth and justice, and it was to determine if the person was virtuous. So actually, when you walk into the exhibit here at the National Museum of Funeral History, you will actually see this scale of judgment depicted on the back wall of the tomb. It is here where you see the heart of the deceased placed on the scale being weighed against the ostrich feather. If the scale was balanced, then you lived a good life. And if your heart was heavier than the feather, then your soul was filled with darkness. The second element of the body is the Yaka. The Yaka is the shining one, or the soul that is transported. And it is the combination of your Ba and your Ka, which is the soul that comes from your deity or higher power, and it is also your spirit, which helps to keep you happy and to feed your soul. Then, of course, we all know this. This is the name. We all have a name. So if you think about it, our name goes all the way back to the Egyptian time periods when it was used to identify the deceased, and we still use our name in life and in death. It was previously hidden for fear that in the afterlife it could have been tampered with if anyone knew their identity or their name. Your shadow is what is left of the deceased, of their actual flesh and bones. So your shadow is your body, if you think about it. It's your flesh and bones that are left behind during the Egyptian time periods. But today, our shadow is our reflection that we see on the ground when the sun is standing behind us. So interesting where the term shadow comes from. It comes from the flesh and bones of the body that was left behind. The heart was everything to the Egyptians. For them, your heart was where your seat of intellect and emotions were housed. And it was not the brain. They felt the brain had absolutely no significance. But we know today that the brain is where our intellect and our emotional responses are actually held. Because the Egyptians did not know how the brain worked. So they actually discarded the brain. It wasn't a significant organ during the preparations of the body. Interesting enough. It was all your other organs and your heart, that which kept your body going. But now we know the brain is what is required to keep your body going. And then the Ka. Oh, the Ka. The Ka is the life force or spiritual double of the person that remained dead. When the Ka left the body, the person was believed to be dead. During the funeral, the Ka demanded attention, and it needed to be given offerings. And these offerings appeased the Ka and kept them from getting angry or torture the Egyptians that were still living. And they also believed that the ka laid the foundation for funeralization. Right? You got to please the spirit that's left behind. You've got to make sure that that body that's left behind and the spirit that leaves that body continues a happy journey into the afterlife. So one of the elements that the Egyptians worshipped was the cult of Osiris. Now, this is a very interesting story because when we get into the cult of this Osiris, we're going to start talking about some of the family members of Osiris. And these family members were very significant because they all linked together to some degree, which then leads to the different elements that are depicted on the canopic jars, which are very important in the Egyptian embalming process because it was the canopic jars that were used to hold very specific organs of the body during the embalming process. So we're going to speak to Osiris himself. He is the husband of Isis. He's the brother of Seth. He's also the judge of the dead and god of the underworld. Isis, his wife, turned into a bird, and she is the winged goddess that you see depicted throughout the exhibit. Her brother, who is also the uncle of Horus, is very important to the story that we are going to tell. And then Horus is the son of Isis and Osiris. He has a hawked head, and he is known for killing his uncle Seth. So the story goes that Osiris had a brother named Seth. Seth was jealous of his brother Osiris. He played a trick on Osiris and trapped him in a box. He sealed the box and he threw the box into the sea. Isis, his wife, searched for him long and far, found the box, but unfortunately Seth arrived at the same time and captured the box and cut Osiris into 14 pieces and scattered them throughout Egypt. It is then when Isis became a bird and flew all around Egypt to gather all the parts of Osiris to reassemble him. Even though he was reassembled, he was no longer able to be the pharaoh on earth. So he became the god of the underworld and judgment of the dead. So the last element that the Egyptians believed in for the burial practices and caring for the dead was the fourth one, the circle of necessity. In the circle of necessity, they believed the Ba began a 3,000-year round-trip journey around the sun. And they believed that life would continue through the Ba because your Ka was at the grave with your body. After the 3,000-year journey, prayers would reunite the Ba with the Ka and the rest of the elements. The body had to be intact to entice the Ba to return. Therefore, the importance of the embalming process was so that the body would be available for the Ba to return. And just like Osiris, Isis believed that it was important for her to be able to find all the parts and elements of Osiris in order for his Ba to be able to return back and join with the Ka, thus completing the circle of necessity. So during the embalming process, the Egyptians would actually bring out the internal organs in order to obtain a better preservation of the entire body, but the organs were placed in canopic jars, and these are jars that were made of alabaster, limestone, basalt, and other materials used by the early Egyptians to store the visceral organs of the deceased. So each jar represents the four sons of Horus. Horus was responsible for hunting Seth and killing him for the acts that he did on Osiris, which was the husband of Isis. He basically hunted down Seth to find him and kill him for what he did to their father. So each of the jars represented the four sons of Horus. The first jar, Meztha, was a man-headed jar, and it was used to protect the stomach and the large intestines. The second jar was the Twi-motif jar. That one depicts a jackal-headed, dog-like image on the top of the jar, and that was used to protect the heart and the lungs. The third jar, known as the Kibsinuf jar, was the hawk-headed jar, and that was used to protect the liver and the gallbladder. The fourth jar, the Hapi jar, is the dog-headed jar that's used to protect the small intestines. And each of these jars, once the visceral organs were placed within them, the jars were then placed inside the sarcophagus or the burial vessel of the body for the final resting place. So as we discussed earlier, that the Egyptian embalming practice has a very significant influence on the embalming practices that we use today. Today we embalm for 3 reasons. We embalm for disinfection, preservation, and restoration. Historically, it wasn't safe to be around dead bodies due to the threat of disease and plagues. Ghost stories and evil spirits evolved around the deceased, and diseases came from the dead. People didn't know about viruses and bacterias and blood-borne pathogens. They just knew people around dead bodies would become sick and sometimes die. They assumed it was of the evil spirits doing. However, cultures learned that if you stayed with the dead bodies, they assumed it was because of the evil spirits. Culturals learned that if you stayed with the dead bodies, that you would get sick. So they would protect the living by doing something with the dead body, like burying them. We also learned that gifts and offerings were brought to the dead to appease the spirit, so that the spirit would not get angry at the living and cause them problems. The Egyptians showcased many of these elements that we observed today in the embalming and or burial practices. The Egyptians believed that you needed to preserve the body in order for the spirit to return from its circle of necessity, which included the journey around the sun, that 3,000-mile journey that we spoke to, of the Ba finally returning and meeting back up with the Ka. To protect the body from the natural elements, they would put them in primitive coffins, which we will discuss later, and their desire to preserve the actual bodies is what led to the embalming process. Egyptians, as we said before, were our first funeral service providers. Just like we discussed earlier that we have 3 reasons for embalming. The reasons for embalming during the Egyptian time period was similar to ours. However, sanitation and religion were the 2 necessities that they believed were the reasons for embalming the body. For sanitation purposes, the Egyptians buried the bodies in the sand because they believed that by burying them in the sand, it would stop the spread of diseases and plagues. What the Egyptians didn't realize is that they accidentally discovered that the sand helps to dehydrate the body, and the effects of that dehydration led to the development of embalming. The sand and arid climate pulled moisture out of the body faster than the body could decompose. And then the Egyptians realized that getting rid of body moisture would prevent decomposition and preserve the body. Later, they discovered natron, which is a salt solution that they would use for packing the body and helping to withdraw, again, more of the moisture, creating that dehydration process, preserving the body prior to decomposition. Religiously, the Egyptians believed that by preserving the body, they provided a place for the Ba, which is the soul of your body that was given to you by your deity, to return in the afterlife, thus completing the circle of necessity. Therefore, religion became a primary reason for embalming. Again, the Egyptians needed to preserve the body so that the returning of the Ba, rejoining with the Ka, completing that circle of necessity, was important. Even though they desired to preserve the body, they also believed that it was important that they protect it from the elements of nature by keeping it from touching the ground. To protect the body from the natural elements, they would put them in primitive coffins. Their desire to preserve the actual body is also what led to embalming. And thus we believe that the Egyptians are our first embalmers. We talked about in one of the elements that they found when embalming the bodies, besides exposing them to the sand and the dry climate of the air, they found natron. Natron is a combination of salts, salt and soda compounds. Dry lake beds of the desert would produce this salt. The Egyptians were able to cultivate the natron from the lake beds and use it in preparing the bodies. The deceased sometimes were covered with this product and thus dehydrating them and keeping them from decaying. The composites of natron are sodium chloride, sodium carbonate, sodium sulfate, and potassium nitrate. It was all of those elements combined helped to preserve the organs of the body. From the discovery of the different elements that the Egyptians learned they could use in order to preserve the body, they have found over 400,000 human mummies to date. Many have been lost to history. Mummies were used as fuel for trains during the English colonization of Egypt, and no longer looking for mummies due to controversy about disturbing graves also led to them not being able to discover any more than the 400,000 that they have recorded historically. In discovering the different mummies, they learned that there were different types of embalming practices used on the bodies. They learned that this was due to their social status. Embalming was required for all Egyptian bodies, but they were of different levels, or as you would call, embalming packages. So the Egyptians classified them, or I should say we classified them by grades based off of how they were able to determine the different levels of embalming each body went through. There were 3 different grades or classifications of the embalming process on the human body. Grade 1 was considered the lowest class of embalming. The body was wrapped tightly in a cloth to purge any internal organs and intestines of their liquids. The body was placed in the natron for dry burial. That was the most inexpensive form. Then it was covered with a wood tar called pitch, and the body was then returned to the family. This was the most abundant type of bodies found, and they were the most well preserved. Grade 2 is the middle class of embalming. This entailed inserting a rectal plug and injecting the body cavities with cedar oil. The cedar oil was a cedar resin that acted as an insecticide and antimicrobial amber sap that became solid as a stone over time. The body was placed in natron for 70 days. The cedar oil dissolved the internal organs. The rectal plug was removed and the contents were drained out. The body was then returned to the family. Grade 3 embalming, which was used for the upper class and the royalty or pharaohs, were embalmed in a very unique and time-consuming way. The first was removal of the brain. They would do this by inserting a hook into the nostril, puncture the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, remove the brain piece by piece, and discard it. Then they would pack the cranium through the nose with linen strips soaked in pitch, wood tar, or asphalt compound. Then it was left to dry, and the insides of the head would dry hard as a stone. Secondly, the body was then eviscerated of its organs. The Egyptians removed the organs through a small incision in the abdomen. They washed the organs in wine and spices and returned them to the cavity that was packed with spices, oils, resins, and perfumes. The other option, if they did not want the organs returned to the body, it was to place the organs into the canopic jars. This was only available on the most expensive package. Again, the canopic jars, 4 of them, all depicted the heads that were symbolic of the sons of Horus. After eviscerating the organs, the incision was closed with resin or wax and then covered with wax or a metal plate engraved with the eye of Horus from the myth of Isis and Horus. The offering of the eye symbolized a deity in need that receives an eye and is restored to well-being. The eye's restorative power meant the Egyptians considered it a symbol of protection against evil, in addition to other meanings. Then immersed in natron for the longest amount of time, removal from natron, bandaged, and returned to the families. Bodies were dehydrated by immersing them for 20 to 70 days, but usually 40 is all was needed. The body was then cleansed, straightened, and exposed to the sun for additional dehydration. Then the body was bandaged. The bandaging used 1,200 yards of a 3 by 1/4 inch linen bandage. In the most expensive package, this was provided by affixing it with a gum or glue, that many thought was mema or persa, hence a mummy. The body was then wrapped with religious amulets or objects with special powers that brought good fortune and other items. The fingers and toenails often fell off in the natron, but were reattached by wrapping with gold wire or replaced with gold thimbles. That like you would see for sewing thimbles. There were elaborate services of prayers recited during the entire wrapping process. Expensive ornamentation was often added before placing the mummy in a wood or stone container. Think that of King Tut's breastplate. Bandaging took 30 days to complete because it was a religious ceremony. After all was done, the body was then returned to the family or put in their final burial place. We now know that heat is not necessary for mummification, but only dry, moving air to dehydrate and preserve the bodies. Mummies have also been found in cold mountain regions, which leads us to believe that there are other elements that are responsible for removing the moisture from the human body, mummifying it, forever encasing it in the body in which the Ba and Ka resided. The embalming process of the ancient Egyptians was very extensive. It had a lot of significant practices that were influenced culturally, religiously, and by the tools and the instruments that were available for the Egyptians to use. It continued to evolve over time. As we all know today, the mummification process of the human body doesn't necessarily mean that it needs an extensive amount of heat, but rather only dry air moving over it to dehydrate it and preserve the body, as we have found mummies in very cold mountainous regions. The mummification process helped to preserve the body, which once held the Ba and Ka. The National Museum of Funeral History pays tribute to our ancient Egyptians, our first embalmers, by having an exhibit that actually showcases many of the elements and or stories that were told here on this podcast. The exhibit showcases a tomb that inside has a mummy on one of their preparation tables and the depiction of Anubis, our Egyptian god of embalming, preparing the deceased. You can also see the canopic jars and all of the different features of each jar, as well as the winged goddess of Isis and the scales of judgment. We hope that you'll visit the National Museum of Funeral History and get a more in-depth understanding of how our Egyptians prepared our bodies for an eternal rest. Thank you for joining me today on this podcast, and I hope that you will share this episode and our future episodes with family and friends. We look forward to any feedback you have to offer by giving us a review on Apple or Spotify, and we hope that you will join us for a virtual tour at www.nmfh.org. And always remember, any day above ground is a good one.